Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison. I'm joined this week by my National Post colleagues Terry Glavin and Sabrina Mado, and we're here to talk about the truth, which apparently is out there, but you have to look bloody hard most days to find it. So, welcome both. Now, the premise for this discussion is essentially the backlash to a 5,500-word piece that Terry wrote for the Post called The Year of the Graves, which was about the residential schools issue. And I don't propose that we necessarily delve deep into the residential schools issue, but focus more on what John Stuart Mill calls the tyranny of prevailing opinion and the crisis of trust in what is true. So, Terry, you wrote, "It's later than you think," in reference to the truth, I presume. Maybe you could sum up your 5,500-word piece in a couple of sentences and then tell us a little bit about the reaction.
Oh, gosh. Well, the gist of the piece, it was on the anniversary of the news from Kamloops, was to look at what happened last summer. And it's already kind of disappearing down the memory hole. People don't really, I think, maybe a little bit embarrassed to talk about what really happened last summer. Mayhem, riots, the flags lowered on all government buildings, Canada dragged in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, churches burned and vandalized across the country. It was pretty weird. And by the end of the summer, the way it's usually presented is 1,300 graves or suspected graves were found at residential school sites. Began with a report out of, it was really the New York Times where things went crazy. A mass grave found in Kamloops. And basically none of it was true. So I think that's a pretty big deal. By that I mean Chief Roseanne Casimir at Kamloops, who's a fine woman and in a very, very difficult situation, never said anything I've ever taken any objection to, did not say they found a mass grave. 751 graves at Cowessess, Marieville in Saskatchewan, site of an Indian residential school, Catholic cemetery. Nobody knows how many, if. I think there's probably, and I don't question that there's probably kids from the adjacent residential school in that cemetery, but no, 751 children from a residential school, graves suspected or otherwise, didn't happen. In fact, the local chief was very, very clear about that. That's the photograph of Justin Trudeau with the teddy bear kneeling at a grave of allegedly a residential school child. Penelakut did not announce that they had discovered 160 plus graves at an Indian residential school. They didn't make any announcement at all. There was a memo that was sent to the Cowichan tribes across the from the Sussy Reserve into the valley about a march that was coming up. Reference was made in that memo to the other chiefs several days before the story broke about graves that had been found in the Penelakut territory, which I am very familiar with. I spent a good bit of time there with those people. And there was no announcement. He didn't even say that. I don't even think he mentioned the associated these alleged graves or possible graves, probable graves, on the foreshore he talked about it in the territory. Don't even know if he associated it with the residential school. I think the most absurd was at the Akam community, St. Eugene's in the vicinity of Cranbrook, British Columbia. In that case, was it 180 or 280 graves? I forget. Another discovery of graves at a residential school. No discovery. They were not, in fact, no announcement. The first thing the chief said about it was, "This is not true." This was a white cemetery, 1875. We're mostly Catholics up here. That's where we've been burying our dead. There was a residential school there. There was a hospital there. There's fires and the little crosses get burned, and we've been trying to figure out exactly where all the graves are. It's from an event that happened last year when remains were partially disinterred. So that's it.
So suffice it to say, Terry, you questioned the existence of mass graves, but you didn't question the cultural genocide of residential schools, or the disturbing catalogue of rape, abuse and neglect that took place there, children being ripped from their families, schools being poorly located, poorly built, poorly maintained, heating and ventilation inadequate, food meagre, discipline harsh. You didn't question any of that, and yet the reaction suggested you had.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I mean, I actually co-authored a book with the survivors of St. Mary's Indian Residential School some time ago. I've argued for the proposition that this should be understood, the schools should be understood in the context of cultural genocide. I don't hold any heterodox views whatsoever about residential schools. I don't think. But yeah, there's this thing that happens when you just sort of point out some facts. And I mean, this is really a story about white people going crazy. I never questioned anything that the indigenous leaders said at the local level. In fact, I said, we really should have been paying attention to what they were saying.
So can I come to the Canada Land interview, though, because this is about the reaction. It featured some fairly salty language, mainly from you, and it was what the captain in Cool Hand Luke might have described as a failure to communicate. What struck me about the interview was that the
free and frank exchange of views. Yeah.
The interviewer Jesse Brown did not disagree with your facts or characterization of residential schools as cultural genocide. What he was upset about was the fact that other people might weaponize your words. And you replied, was perfect. You said, I think I have to tell the truth. Now, it seems to me that the real weaponization was carried out by other critics, like academic Sean Carlton, who accused you of trying to undermine Truth and Reconciliation and cast doubt on the abuse and deaths at residential schools, which seems to be an utterly ludicrous interpretation of what you were saying.
Yeah. I don't know where to start there, but the interview that you heard on Canada Land was not the interview I did with Jesse Brown. The splices and cunning little edits, and I mean, it was like something out of a Simpsons cartoon. I actually posted the actual interview on my newsletter called The Real Story. Everybody should subscribe. But this fellow Sean Carlton that has sort of emerged on the national scene in the concept of residential schools denier, or denialism. Sean Carlton is very well known in Vancouver as the guy who made a big fuss a couple of years ago about the Vancouver Canucks logo and how it was cultural appropriation of Coast Salish art, a big, huge deal. And, when an actual reporter from a mainstream news organization inquired into this, he had no authority to be going around claiming that the Vancouver Canucks logo was cultural appropriation. All of the local Coast Salish tribes would have actually been consulted about the logo, said, yeah, it kind of looks like Indigenous art, but don't worry about it, we like it. And were not saying that it was cultural appropriation. He's kind of co-invented or invented and defined or co-defined this idea of residential schools denialism. And it's designed to shut people up. It's designed to dismiss anybody who says, well, wait a minute, what about this? As equivalent to a genocide denier.
Sabrina, let me bring you in. So we're sticking with the residential school story, and Terry's already mentioned the Trudeau picture with the teddy bear, which kind of epitomised this this kind of loss of departure from reality. At the time, his ministers were encouraging this overdue reckoning on residential schools, and this ideologically rigid narrative was struck. Truth be damned. I mean, in this case, and in many others, it seems that we are governed by narrative. Is this government in particular taking it to new excesses?
Absolutely. Obviously, photo ops and narrative have always been important in politics, but under Justin Trudeau, they've become the dominant priority, that they're more concerned about photo ops and being seen doing things than actually doing things. And the example of the photo from a year ago is a prime example of this, because the Trudeau administration has failed Indigenous peoples time and time again whether it comes to truth and reconciliation, whether it comes to clean drinking water in their communities. But of course, he has time for this photo op that then became a defining photo of that news cycle. And it's unfortunate because it distracts from the real issues, it distracts from real accountability, and it just serves nothing but his own interests.
And having set the narrative, nobody can depart from the narrative.
Absolutely. Especially, images are king these days. And once that image is out there and that's defining the narrative, that's all people think. And that it's hard to get them to consider anything else.
So, Terry, you then wrote about the reaction and talked about the truth issue, which is what we're really talking about here. And you talked about the collapse of consensus in how we go about determining what is true and what isn't. And you say that journalistic, academic and government policy is conflating knowledge with belief. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, this has been a concern of mine. I've been writing about it for some time now. There's a number of books. I should just grab them off my shelf. And Ophelia Benson and Jeremy Stangroom wrote a wonderful book about 20 years ago called Why Truth Matters. And I think the what's been happening increasingly and in tandem with the collapse of conventional news media, the rise of social media, the ubiquity of vanity news organization startups, and also the ubiquity of, as the Americans saw during the campaign that elected Donald Trump, of foreign disinformation campaigns. And just, in Canada, it's actually mainly Beijing based, and there's also a whole galaxy of sort of news sites out of Tehran and out of Caracas, and that's the new environment we're living in. And in the year leading up to Year of the Graves, I think there were about 2,000 journalists who lost their jobs in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. And so, it was on the anniversary of the George Floyd event in the United States. The worst civil disobedience since the 1960s, or civil unrest since the 1960s. And immediately, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett says, this is our George Floyd moment. We have to get anti-racism and anti-colonialism into our DNA. Before Chief Casimir had an opportunity to correct the story, okay? Right. Over that weekend, that's when the flags were lowered. It was like a blunt trauma wound to the head. Mass grave, holy cow. And there has been this kind of underworld, kind of Alex Jones, satanic ritual abuse, weird stuff about mass graves around residential schools. Have been going around for a long time. I just saw another instance. There has been, attempts to fact check all of this. Agence France Presse had to fact check an alleged mass grave at a school at the Mohawk Institute. And so suddenly, when you got the New York Times and everybody's saying, wow, a mass grave, everyone thinks, my God, UFOs are real. And so, the thing about, you've got Trudeau taking a knee at Marieval. You've got Trudeau taking a knee a year before for Black Lives Matter. The shooting in Texas. Well, we have to do something about our gun laws. This is like a G7 country run by a social media marketing strategy.
Right. Well, so social media, you bring that up, and I think clearly misinformation from foreign agencies is a thing. But Sabrina, there's a new poll from Abacus Data this week suggesting 44% of Canadians agree with the statement that much of the information we receive from news organisations is false, and 52% that believe that government accounts cannot be trusted. How much of this can be scepticism is amplified by social media?
I think it comes down to a few things. One is a lack of media literacy across all age groups. Another one is there has been a decline in news quality, largely due to the shift to having to cater to social media and the digital environment where everything is immediate, who's quickest. That's what's rewarded, often over quality and getting things right. which is a major problem. And at the same time, newsrooms have been struggling with their finances, laying off reporters. The people who still exist are more overworked, and again, just trying to be quickest, trying to be first rather than getting things right. But another interesting thing is, I think, how partisanship is affecting this, and how partisans look to discredit people who they don't agree with. A year ago, it would be, if I don't agree with you, you're offensive, you're offending me, and you're crossing the line. And now I'm finding more and more in replies on social media that people are responding to facts that they don't like with not, oh, you're offending me, but this is misinformation, it's disinformation, it's fake news. And that's now the go-to response to anything that they don't like to hear. And that's problematic, because there is real disinformation and misinformation, and it's a real problem, but they're watering down the issue by accusing people of it just to, meet their own political ends.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's undeniable that social intolerance is stifling debate. I mean, I mentioned John Stuart Mill earlier. I always go back to him on liberty. He gave 3 reasons for free speech. The opinion deemed objectionable might be true. Secondly, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. 3, conflicting doctrines often share the truth between them. I think that is often forgotten, certainly on social media. Terry, last word to you. How do we get out of this mess?
I think we have to recognize that it's worse than John Stuart Mill suggested. No longer, it's not just that truth doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter that truth doesn't matter anymore. And my concern, and it has been because what I've been covering for at least 20 years now, is that, the collapse of democracy worldwide and within democracies as well, is that if narrative is all that matters, then at the end of the day, the narrative that will prevail is the narrative with the loudest voice, the deepest pockets, the shiniest boots, and the sharpest knives. Truth is all we got, kids. Truth is the only thing we have. And this is the last bulwark. This is it. These are the ramparts. It's later than we think.
Right. Thank you both for coming on. Very edifying. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.